Good evening, everybody, and welcome. I am Tressa Dunworth. I'm an associate professor here at the law school, and along with my colleague, Dr. Anna Hood, we are absolutely delighted to be able to welcome you here. Gosh, and the show hasn't even started.
I'll just put that there in case you want to put it up. I don't know.
So we've been very pleased, Anna and I, to work with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in hosting today's celebration, and so we'd like to thank the whole team for the idea, for putting it together, and for working so closely. And I think it's a very good example of cooperation between government and civil society, or at the very least outside of government. I want to especially welcome all my disarmament law students today, and I know that that's favouritism, but it was in this very lecture theatre that we met when we were able to in COVID time, so it's very nice to be back. Having had the chance to mix and mingle upstairs, and I hope that everybody got to have a drink and some of that delicious food, we're now moving to the more formal part of the event. In a moment, I will introduce our speaker this evening, the Honourable Phil Twyford, Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control. But first, let me just quickly explain the order of proceedings from here on in. We'll start by hearing from the Minister when I sit down, and then we will recognise again the role that civil society has played in Aotearoa in bringing this treaty about. And therefore, the Ministry helpfully have brought together people who are going to stand up for just a minute, introduce themselves and say what the treaty means to them. And I want to particularly note that the Ministry have organised many of those, not all, to come from around the country today to share with it, because of course it's a bad time of the year to have a grand national event, but this is the best that we could do under the circumstances. And after that, then we will be opening the floor for Q&A following on from the Minister's speech, and nobody better equipped to facilitate that discussion than our very own Ambassador for Disarmament, Del Higgy, who is here at the front. Del will be known to many of you, and she has been the government's point person on nuclear disarmament and other types of disarmament for several years now. But most significantly for the purposes of our work this evening, Del was the Vice President, or one of the Vice Presidents, for the negotiation of this treaty in 2017 in New York. So it really is a privilege to have Del here and coordinating the Q&A session on the basis of the Minister's speech. So we aim, perhaps a little optimistically, to be finishing up by 6 o'clock. We are very aware that it is a Friday evening, summertime in Auckland, and I don't think that the sun is shining, but it could have been shining, or it might be shining by the time we're finished, so we should be prepared to get out there. I also want to say that we are being videoed and recorded. There will be a camera at the front during Q&A. If you do not want your image captured, can you please let myself or Anna know, and we will make sure that that doesn't happen. The event is also being live streamed, and I want to give a big shout out to our technical crew, the video production people, who have been simply amazing, helpful and professional. And we're just delighted to have them, so thank you. So turning now to our speaker for this evening, and I won't take up any more of our precious time together. It is a great privilege to welcome you here to the Law School, Minister, and we really appreciate and value your time on a Friday evening. We would value it anyway, but we particularly value it on a Friday evening. Although, as you know, the Minister has only recently been appointed to this portfolio, we hold high hopes and high ambitions for him. I'd like to say no pressure, but no, there really is pressure. So, you know. So although he has only recently been appointed to this particular ministerial portfolio, he does actually have a long history in this area, from being a young man activist in those great years of the 1980s, through to when he embarked on his career working for Oxfam, which international humanitarian law, so the laws of war, have a big part of Oxfam's work. And it has also meant that back in the 1990s, which to me only feels like 5 minutes ago, but anyway, you're supposed to say back in the 1990s, he was involved in the starting discussions about controlling and monitoring trade in small arms, a serious problem that unfortunately, despite a treaty on the matter, there's still a lot of work to be done. But for tonight, we're celebrating success, although no doubt in our question time we will look to the work that is still yet to come. So join with me, please, now in giving a very warm welcome to Minister Twyford.
Kia ora tātou, ngā nui, kia koutou. Tressa, thank you for that lovely introduction. And I want to acknowledge and thank you and Anna for making us so welcome today and hosting this celebration. I want to start by greeting and acknowledging all of the activists and the campaigners who are here today. You know, there was a time in this country when to call someone an activist in the newspaper was pretty much a term of abuse. Now we recognise that activists make policy. They change the world, and they set the direction for movements and for governments to follow. And I want to acknowledge all of the activists and campaigners who are here today, from the youngest students in the room today through to Richard Northey. Actually, it's not true. I shouldn't pick on Richard. There's Laurie as well. And one of the great things about this issue is that it has captured the imagination of generations of New Zealanders who have committed themselves to the anti-nuclear movement here and worldwide. And as a country, we have made a difference. I want to acknowledge and thank the representatives of the Diplomatic Corps who are here tonight. I want to say hi to my Labour parliamentary colleagues, Helen White and Naisi Chen and Camilla Bellich, and also acknowledge Golriz Garaman from the Greens, who was here but had to leave for another event. Chairman Wayne Mapp and members of the Public Advisory Committee on Disarmament and Arms Control. Justice Gerard van Behemen, who is the former permanent rep at the United Nations in New York, and Ambassador Del Higgy. And Del, I want to thank you and recognise the huge contribution that you've made as a public servant on this work.
Yeah.
And my old friend and predecessor in this role of Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control, the Honourable Matt Robson. And Matt, I want to recognise your lifelong commitment and ongoing work on this issue.
Not as long as Richard's.
That's true. It's a very exclusive club. Tressa, I hope your lectures aren't as rowdy as this. And people unfurling protest banners in the front row. I mean, I remember that stuff going on in the 1980s, but I don't think it happens at the Auckland University Law School very much these days. Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Some of us are old school.
Yeah. I'm absolutely stoked that you've all turned out tonight on a Friday night in summer to celebrate this really important issue. It's a huge pleasure to be marking what is such an historic occasion, the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Doesn't that sound good? It's a moment that many feared would never come, and it would remain forever some aspirational goal for future generations of dreamers and idealists to grapple with. But today is a moment for celebration and above all for hope. It's the culmination of efforts across generations, efforts which have spanned the globe. And it's a reward for the activists, the campaigners, the academics, religious leaders, politicians and public servants who never lost faith in the promise of a world without nuclear weapons. Now, many, if not all of you in this room have been involved in the campaign against nuclear weapons. Today is your celebration, as much or more than it is the 52 governments who have now ratified the treaty. What's been achieved together is remarkable, and I hope that it will be a source of inspiration for the international community as we try to tackle other seemingly insurmountable challenges. Now, for most of us here, there's no need for advertisements for Steinlager or the McDonald's Kiwi burger to remind us of the important part that nuclear disarmament plays in our national identity and in our independent foreign policy. But I'm kind of glad that they do advertise it, because being anti-nuclear is Kiwi as. Am I right? Yeah. The leadership role that our country continues to play on this issue has its foundation in the groundswell of public opposition to nuclear weapons in the latter part of the 20th century, triggered in this country in large part by outrage at nuclear testing in the Pacific. Flotillas of private vessels sailing to disrupt the French at Mororoa, tens of thousands of signatures on the petitions presented to Parliament by CND and others, the rolling out of nuclear weapon-free zones across the country, people's homes and churches and marae, suburbs and whole cities. And as should be the case in a democracy, our foreign policy followed closely behind. Particularly and most memorably with Norman Kirk's dispatch of HMNZS Otago with Minister Fraser Coleman on board to French Polynesia in 1973. And the first, have you seen the images of Matt Rata and Kirk and Fraser Coleman down on the Auckland wharves when the frigate was about to head off to French Polynesia? And the first of our cases against France at the International Court of Justice in the same year. And the peace movement gathered strength in the 1980s, and as a 19-year-old, quite a few of my Friday nights were spent marching from one end of Queen Street to the other. Laurie was there, she remembers. And when then Prime Minister Sir Robert Muldoon invited US Navy vessels to Auckland, we were there in sailboats and kayaks and surfboards and all manner of craft to give them a real Kiwi anti-nuclear welcome. The shocking bombing of the Rainbow Warrior in 1985 seared anti-nuclear sentiment into the New Zealand psyche, and it was followed by the welcome establishment by treaty of a nuclear-free South Pacific in 1987 and the passage of the iconic New Zealand Nuclear-Free Zone Disarmament and Arms Control Act also in that same year. And I'm terribly proud as a Labour MP that it was the election of the fourth Labour government in 1984 that made nuclear-free official government policy. In the 1990s, we tried to take France again to the ICJ. With rather more success, we voted at the UN in favour of securing an advisory opinion from the court on the legality of nuclear weapons, and then, supported by very strong showing by New Zealand civil society, lodged strong arguments with the court on their illegality. So this question of legality and illegality is not new. And one of the points that I want to make to you today is that this important milepost of the treaty coming into force has a whakapapa, it has a lineage, and it's the result of years and years and decades of activism and intellectual work and marching in the streets and lobbying and campaigning for public office. Our advocacy for nuclear disarmament has continued at the UN, at all meetings of parties to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and in the context of our strong support for the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty adopted in 1996. And most recently, one of my very first acts as the new Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control, I took part in a Zoom meeting with ministers from around the Pacific, the states parties to the Rarotonga Treaty, which is what gives us the South Pacific Nuclear Free Zone. We've worked for many years with our colleagues, our partners in the New Agenda Coalition, to push for legally binding measures on nuclear disarmament. We've worked too as part of what's called the de-alerting group. Those disarmament nerds in the audience will know what this is. For the rest of us, it's a grouping set up during actually Phil Goff's tenure as Minister for Disarmament and Arms Control to promote as a very useful transitional measure the lowering of the launch readiness of nuclear weapons. More recently, earlier in this past decade, we were one of the original group of 16 countries launching the initiative on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And as many of you will know, this initiative played a critical role in putting the spotlight back on the very real human cost and risk which nuclear weapons entail. Importantly, it was this initiative which laid the foundation for the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Underlying the activism on disarmament by civil society and successive New Zealand governments from the 1970s through the 1990s was the sense of a real, clear and present danger posed by regional and world events. The horrors of nuclear testing in the Pacific. The exponential growth in nuclear stockpiles as a result of the Cold War arms race, and the very real fear of nuclear conflagration. And in fact, polling in the mid-1980s revealed nuclear war was the threat that Kiwis were most concerned about. But in the years that have followed, attention and activism on nuclear disarmament has waned, with the focus shifting somewhat to other environmental issues, and particularly, and rightly, climate change. But our work on nuclear disarmament is far from over. There are still more than 13,000 nuclear warheads in the arsenals of 9 states, with the US and Russia accounting for 12,000 of them. That's more than enough to end life on this planet many times over. Reductions in the stockpile have slowed, and in a concerning trend, some nuclear powers are now increasing the size of their arsenals. It's widely believed that nuclear risk is increasing alongside the deterioration of the global security environment and ongoing threats to multilateral institutions and the international rules-based order. In the past few years, major military powers have been dismissive of the contribution that disarmament and arms control can make to the building of trust and confidence and the reduction of international tensions. Instead, they've walked away from numerous multilateral and bilateral agreements that played an important role in preserving the security environment. Global tensions and mistrust have increased the prospect and the risk of miscalculation and escalation. Nuclear-armed states have developed military doctrines that contemplate the use of nuclear weapons in a growing range of circumstances, while continuing efforts to develop and deploy new types of nuclear weapons that would seem to lower the threshold for nuclear conflict. Public statements about the deployment of so-called tactical, low-yield, or more survivable nuclear weapons, some of which are more powerful than the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, indicate a deeply troubling shift away from the wisdom contained in the Reagan-Gorbachev maxim that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. At the same time, the prospect of human error has not disappeared, and there's no shortage of documented near misses involving nuclear weapons to serve as a reminder of how close the world has come to nuclear catastrophe. Against this backdrop, it's clear that nuclear weapons continue to pose as much of a threat, if not a greater threat, than they did during the height of the Cold War. Yet while the major powers were at that time willing and able to conclude landmark agreements intended to halt the arms race and progress nuclear disarmament, they argue now that the current environment is somehow not conducive to such developments. We recognise the challenges posed by the current international security environment. Indeed, we work tirelessly as a government in support of broader efforts to uphold the rules-based order and multilateralism and to address specific proliferation challenges like North Korea and Iran. But we cannot and must not entrap ourselves in a catch-22 scenario whereby progress on disarmament is made contingent upon improvements in the broader security context, at the very same time as that context is actually being aggravated by the lack of progress. As we've previously said with our New Agenda Coalition partners, and I quote, "There's a direct causal link between the reduction of nuclear weapons and possible attempts to acquire them. The dynamic of an arms race has always been that possession provides the incentive for acquisition. Proliferation begets proliferation." It's a grim and unsettling outlook, and it explains, I think, why the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is needed now more than ever. And it's why today it's so encouraging that the new Biden administration has announced that it's seeking a 5-year extension of the New START treaty with Russia. Without this, the treaty would have lapsed in early February, removing any limit on the number of Russian and US nuclear-armed submarines, bombers and missiles, with all of the consequences that would have for nuclear disarmament. And it's our sincere hope that the new administration in Washington will re-engage seriously on nuclear disarmament and carry forward implementation of its commitments under Article 6 of the NPT and recommit to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, that's the Iran nuclear deal. We hope that all nuclear weapons possessors will find a pathway to support and ultimately to sign up to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. I referred before to other pressing global issues such as climate change, which have, I think to a large extent, displaced the activist energy on issues like nuclear disarmament. And within New Zealand, I think it's pretty clear that once the French ceased testing in the Pacific, that much of the focus, public focus and media focus went out of the issue. But I want to reassure you today that the government's pursuit of a nuclear weapon-free world will continue. Whether or not it may be in the forefront of their minds right now, New Zealanders remain firmly opposed to weapons that we see as both inhumane and now illegal. And I can count on all of you here to know exactly why I'm referring now to these weapons as illegal. The treaty that we're celebrating today, the entry into force of that treaty, follows in the path of many other highly significant treaties, like those relating to chemical and biological weapons, and of course in more recent times the Landmines Treaty and cluster munitions. For those countries who join the TPNW, nuclear weapons are from now on, in all contexts and all purposes, illegal as a matter of international law. The treaty has therefore closed what was often referred to as the legal gap on nuclear weapons. It's given us the legal framing for a nuclear weapon-free world. Let me give you a brief outline of some of the key provisions of the treaty. Article 1 establishes a comprehensive prohibition. It's applicable to any state joining the treaty. against the full spectrum of nuclear weapon-related activities. Article 2 is about transparency. Declarations are required from all states parties as to whether or not they possess nuclear weapons anywhere on their territory. New Zealand's return is going to be very short. Article 3 requires parties to maintain the same standard of nuclear safeguards that they have in place under the NPT, or if they do not already have an IAEA comprehensive safeguards agreement in place, they must proceed to do that. Article 6 and 7 deal with victim assistance and environmental remediation. Article 6 requires parties whose persons or territory have been affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons to provide assistance, including medical care and psychological support, and to take appropriate measures towards the environmental remediation of contaminated areas. That's something I think that's very significant in terms of the Pacific. Article 7 provides that parties in a position to do so must provide assistance to other parties that have been affected by nuclear weapons or nuclear testing and for their victims. So that's a very quick and selective overview. I want to stress how proud our government is today to have played a part in bringing this treaty to life. In doing so, it was a privilege to work alongside other like-minded countries and for us all to be able to draw on the commitment and vision of global civil society, led by the Nobel Prize-winning international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons. Today is an important milepost on the road to nuclear disarmament. Of course, the nuclear-armed states are not going to relinquish their nuclear arsenals tomorrow. But when an overwhelming majority of the community of nations, global civil society, scientists, faith leaders, young people, and the broad mass of public opinion all say that nuclear weapons are not only morally and ethically wrong, but wrong and prohibited under international law, then it becomes much more difficult to sustain the argument that nuclear weapons make us safer. It also becomes more difficult for members of the nuclear club to talk as if they are meeting their disarmament obligations under the NPT, while at the same time modernising their arsenals and allowing hard-fought disarmament agreements to lapse. In committing to champion this treaty and to advocate for its universalisation and implementation, New Zealand will at the same time be maintaining our full support for the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. We'll work with all parties to achieve a meaningful outcome from this year's review conference, and will contribute and collaborate with the cross-regional groups of which we're a part, which share our commitment to moving forward on nuclear disarmament. We'll continue to, of course, our committed advocacy for the entry into force of the Comprehensive Nuclear Test Ban Treaty. But rather than look any further into the crystal ball, I want now to close by registering New Zealand's pleasure in company with so many of our Pacific Island partners to be among the first 52 ratifiers of the TPNW, part of the grouping, therefore, which has secured this treaty's entry into force today. Please join me in putting your hands together in tribute to all the mahi by so many people over so many years to produce this historic achievement. You are clapping for yourselves, you know. This is the us. We did this. Yeah, it is a milepost, but it's a very important milepost to changing the world. Now, folks, I'm going to invite a number of students who are here, who've come especially for this event, to come up and join me at the front of the room. And then each of them, in order, are going to make some brief remarks about this issue, their commitment, and the significance of the treaty. So, very conscious that the work that successive generations have done and that we're part of today is about securing a safe future for the whole world. And it's for our kids and their kids that we're doing this. So it's very appropriate that the voice of young people in the anti-nuclear movement is heard, and heard well. So I think you know who you are. Please come on up. So we'll just get everyone to stand in a line. We'll start at one end. Okay. And then work through. My pleasure. Thank you. Good. Thank you. Hey, so just introduce yourself by name and place. Is that all right? Or organisation, if you like. Yeah. Over to you, Liz.
Kia ora everyone, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. My name is Lucy Stewart and I am the coordinator of the Disarmament and Security Centre in Ōtautahi Christchurch. And I support the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons as it's a powerful statement by the majority of the peoples of the world that nuclear weapons are not only immoral but they're also illegal. And this treaty is the culmination of decades of hard work by people across the globe, including the Pacific and here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, Habakisha diplomats, activists, lawyers, government officials, and Indigenous peoples. This treaty is a testament to all of their hard work and perseverance and their bravery to stand up to the nuclear weapon states and say enough is enough. And let us also acknowledge and celebrate that Aotearoa was the first Western Allied state to reject nuclear deterrence and pass legislation to ban visits by nuclear-powered and armed ships. And it's now the work of my generation and the generation after me to take this tool, this treaty, and make it work. And let's keep going until we achieve abolition. Thank you.
Tēnā koutou, ko tāna tōku ingoa, nō te whanganui ata rāhau. Congratulations, really, and thank you. Ngā mihi nui to everyone, past and present, who has made this day possible. Tēnei tiriti has a really inspiring story. It extends the examples set by communities like our own in the Pacific to the world. And to me, it's important to remember that it's really the courage and the persistence of people often risking their young lives in the faces of ships and governments and atomic explosions that has allowed us to have the more legal tools that we have now, like the Treaty of Rarotonga and now the TPNW. E tau te raweanga I tāna tūtaki. It is a story dominated too by the global south and a resistance to the terror and the oppression and the colonisation of those much wealthier and stronger that's been forged by our cooperation. The anti-nuclear fight is often compared to other catastrophes like inequality and climate change. And much like the global south, rangatahi in Aotearoa, across the Moana Nui a Kiwa, across the world, face really no illusion as to the power, political, cultural, economic that we increasingly lack. And so please know that we admire this achievement, not only because it is a major step towards eliminating the biggest threat that we know now to life on Earth, but also because its story offers our younger generations hope of challenging the threats that we will know in our lifetimes, much as it offers a pathway of values to doing so, one of real moral conviction and solidarity. Nāku te raurau, nau te raurau, ka ora ai te iwi. We will never let that idea die. Mei taki and kia ora. Thank you.
Hello. Kia ora, everyone. I'm Desmond McBride. I'm from Hamilton, just pretty much down the road. I believe that the Treaty of the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons is a great plan to reduce the number of nuclear weapons on our planet today. In theory, as long as all nations agree and are prepared to accept the principles and follow the articles of this treaty, I have a lot of hope for the generations to come after me and live in this world without the fear of a threat of a nuclear war. However, unless the UN possesses such power to compel all nations into submission with consequences, I can't share the same optimism as those who support this treaty. The main issue is that the nuclear weapon states, like the bigger countries with the nuclear weapons, who has the power to do this and cause so much harsh and damage to every other little country that doesn't have such nuclear power, resist at any significant changes that might have an effect on their security. I believe the only way moving forward is that if we give all nations nuclear weapons and give an equal playing ground for each and every single nation, or we eliminate all nuclear weapons.
I think we'll go for the second one.
Yeah, fair enough. I would too. These suggestions are ridiculous and unrealistic. However, as long as there are nations who selfishly perceive their security status through the eyes of greed and fear, we will never truly create a starting point as a global community on the process of eliminating nuclear weapons. Kia ora whānau.
Kia ora mai tātou. Tuatahi ki ngā mana whenua katoa o Tāmaki Makaurau, kei te mihi. Tuarua ki te whare wānanga o Tāmaki Makaurau, te kura mo te turi, kei te mihi. Tuatoru ki a koutou katoa, ki te whakarongo ki te kōrero poto tākau, kei te mihi. Ko ai au, ko Jorana Matarena Pointana Haimono tōku ingoa. He uri tēnei no Ngāti Pikia me te whakatōhea hoki. Kei te tino harikoa taku ngā kau ki te tū, ki te kōrero ki a koutou katoa e pāna ki the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. Kia ora tātou, I'm Jorana, and I'm from Ngāti Pikia in Rotorua and te whakatōhea in Opotiki. For me, I believe this treaty, it brings us to a pivotal point in history where we can shift the balance of power from the few to the many through the coming into the force of this treaty. This is the time where dispute resolution tactics can change from if you destroy me to I'll destroy you back, to ones where we can protect people, protect communities, and protect the environment without this mutually assured destruction. We can use this platform to push kaitiakitanga on the international level. We can extend that to caring about people and communities and utilise this mechanism to apologise for past injustices and creating a safer, kinder world for us all to thrive. Ngā mihi.
Vanakkam, kia ora, and greetings to you all. I'm Myra, and I'm a conjoint law and commerce student from Victoria University of Wellington. And the first time I engaged with the issue of nuclear disarmament was about 5 years ago. And at that time, the United Nations General Assembly had just established a working group to create awareness of concrete legal measures to become a nuclear weapon-free world. And now today we celebrate the entry into force of the treaty, and it marks a significant milestone towards the total elimination of nuclear weapons worldwide. However, our job does not stop here today. Nuclear disarmament will not happen overnight, and it certainly isn't up to future generations. In the past year, we have seen the devastating impact of world events with COVID-19. The destructive humanitarian consequences of the use of nuclear weapons is not something any country or state is able to prepare for or deal with. So when young people like ourselves are educated, engaged, empowered, and armed with knowledge, we can contribute to living in a world where our children and our grandchildren, your children and grandchildren, don't have to live in fear of mass destruction. And that is the kind of world that we want and we should be living in and leaving behind. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. My name is Maria. I'm from Argentina. No worries, I didn't arrive recently. But I'm a humanitarian lawyer. I'm currently studying my master's in conflict and terrorism here at the University of Auckland. I'm really proud of being here. I'm really thankful to be here today. As the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons enters into force today, this agreement comes as a powerful reminder on the global challenges and tensions that we can overcome if we act together. It also reflects the values of many generations, as we can see today, who believe that nuclear weapons are not only morally unacceptable, but also need to be prohibited under international humanitarian law. Examples as Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they have proven the massive suffering and destructions that these weapons and detonations can cause. Furthermore, organizations such as the International Committee of the Red Cross have already reported on the impossibility for any nation to respond to the catastrophic consequences that they can cause. As a humanitarian lawyer, I'm really, really thankful to have the opportunity of having access to such a legally binding rule and powerful resource to help and protect people in the field. This is why it's so important to keep supporting the TPWN. This agreement has proved its capacity to effectively unite and coordinate the international community when facing a global challenge, which, given the circumstances, I think is really powerful. Thank you. So on behalf of all the young generations, at least for myself, I promise that we will definitely appreciate, we value this, we're thankful, and we promise to protect it for future generations. So kia ora.
Thank you. I don't have any prepared notes. I wasn't intending to speak, but having listened to these speakers, I moved to make a contribution. I'm what is known commonly as an old fellow. I was born some months before the start of the Second World War. My earliest memories are bombers coming over. My home country is Hungary. I was born in Budapest and I grew up there. And as I said, my earliest memories are the bombers coming over and making a run for the bunker where we were supposed to be safe. And it went downhill from there. Hungary was liberated by the Soviets, and we had Stalinism imposed on us. In 1956, the nation rose up against that oppression, which was ruthlessly put down by the Soviets, helped by the fact that some days after the Hungarian uprising, France and Britain invaded Suez and gave the Soviets an excuse to feel justified or above criticism to do their bit. 250,000 armored troops came in and put the Hungarian uprising down. I was in my final year of my high school. I left the country, went to Austria, and I came to New Zealand in 1957 as a refugee. I feel deeply moved by what I heard here. Most of you could be my grandchildren. But I feel moved and I feel comforted by the fact that a stand is being taken against what is probably the worst threat that hangs over humanity. It's not going to be easy. I mean, the defense industry, for example, in the United States, is a huge part of the economy. Their defense budget is more than the next 10 countries put together, of which 9 are allies of the US. So it's an uphill battle, but do we have a choice?
Thank you. Great.
Congratulations, and thank you.
Thank you very much for that closing remark to our youth representatives, which was, I think, very apt. I better start yelling because it's not... Oh, it is on. Okay. Those were tremendous statements. Thank you. Of course, Minister, I mean, yours was great too.
Goes without saying.
Yeah. And we're also very grateful for your willingness to take some questions from the audience here. Now, I'd be very keen if at least the initial set of questions were focused on nuclear disarmament. When I suggested that to the Minister, he said, well, good luck with that. So I'd like you all to help me out here and maybe initially at least put together your thoughts and comments, very quick questions for the Minister. He does have to get to another meeting across town, and we all know, even if we don't live here, what Auckland traffic is like. He does have to get across to another meeting, so I think you have to leave pretty much sharp on 6. Yep. We're not doing bad, we're on time. So, please, can I invite some questions on nuclear disarmament? You can use that. Oh, I can use that one. Okay. I'm going to suggest that maybe we put a couple together. Liz, thank you. You're first off the mark, and anybody else straight after you, Liz. And we'll batch maybe 3 ministers that you might...
Sounds good.
Liz, please.
Kia ora whānau, Liz Rem as well. World Beyond War, Aotearoa, New Zealand from Heratonga, Hawke's Bay. Minister, what can New Zealand do to persuade, for example, our close Five Eyes partners to sign the treaty?
Well,
that is a fantastic
yeah, badger, no badger.
Yeah. Question. Another one's on nuclear disarmament. Oh, great, thank you.
We've been, for the last 70 years, we've been fighting the growth and threat of nuclear weapons. The rationale for banning nuclear weapons has been very clear from the start and has been repeated and amplified for those 70 years. What are we fighting against? Has anybody done an analysis of the drives and the imperatives that result in the so-called civilized world still seeing its security as dependent on its ability to destroy civilization? What rationale is possible there?
Thank you, Gray. The Minister's going to enjoy answering that one. Yes, please.
Should New Zealand be in partnership with a corporation that is the world's largest manufacturer of nuclear weapons, Lockheed Martin, vis-a-vis Rocket Lab?
He didn't need it. Loud enough.
Question related to Rocket Lab and payloads. Minister, is this a good break, or we've got one more?
Okay. Keep going.
I feel Jared Van Behamen's got a question. Felicity might have.
That's all right. We can take these 3. So, Liz, your question was about what should we do about persuading our Five Eyes partners to come on board with the treaty. Those of you who are students of disarmament politics and history will know that the great unfulfilled promise of the NPT has been that the nuclear weapons states have never followed through on their Article 6 obligations and commitment to disarm. And that's been the basis of this very stalemate for a long time now, and drifting for much of the last decade in terms of trying to progress the goals of nuclear disarmament. And so I think what's really significant about the TPNW is it's an attempt to kind of cut through that and short-circuit this stalemate by assembling an overwhelming majority of the world governments of nation states and civil society and everybody else to say unequivocally that nuclear weapons are wrong, they are banned and prohibited under this treaty. And as I said in my remarks, I think that stigmatisation that we've seen works so well with, for instance, the landmines and cluster munitions treaties, I think will help us to reset the international anti-nuclear movement, and it will make it untenable for the nuclear weapons states to maintain this fiction that nuclear weapons make us safer. So, what do we do now? I think what we do is, and I'm very proud of the kind of approach that the New Zealand government takes on this issue. We work every angle that's there to try to advance the cause of nuclear disarmament. We worked with the instigators of this treaty to get it up and running, some of the staunchest critics of the nuclear weapon states. We also work very actively around the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty and the Non-Proliferation Treaty to try to make progress. And so, and I've for a long time believed that we change the world by marching in the streets, but also by drafting the text of conference resolutions and treaties and agreements. And so that's what we will continue to do. In a very activist way, we will continue to work all the angles, including trying to persuade the nuclear weapons states that they must re-engage with disarmament seriously, that bilateral agreements like the New START treaty that we talked about earlier, that we must make progress at the NPT, and ultimately we have to find a pathway for those nuclear weapon states to support the treaty. And that might seem like an outlandish dream now, but that has to be our goal. The Gray, nuclear deterrence, I think you were talking about. I mean, I think, yeah.
You sort of answered that in a way, Minister.
Well, I think the only other thing I would add is that the nuclear weapon states are wedded to this idea of nuclear deterrence as the basis of their security. And I think that, I mean, Kennedy, you've often talked about this for the need for the world to formulate and embrace a new way of thinking about security. Yeah. How does the world become more secure and more safe? And that's, I think, in large part in an unanswered question in terms of this issue on the international stage. But that is something that we have to do. That's a task ahead of us. On should we be in partnership, or should a New Zealand company be in partnership with Lockheed? So Rocket Lab is an American company. That might seem like a technicality, but it is, and it operates out of New Zealand at Mahia Peninsula. Some of you will know that I was the Economic Development Minister that signed off the payloads for that. Our government is committed to supporting the development of a space industry. It offers huge potential benefits to New Zealand in terms of jobs and economic development for this country. But we're also interested in the conversation about how we can, domestically and internationally, regulate for the peaceful uses of space and uses and activities in space that protect the environment. So I think we're just beginning on that, and I think there's more to do. But there's growing interest internationally on how we can pursue this as an international community.
Thank you, Minister. Some other questions? Laurie?
Just to bring people's attention to the question of PAROS, which is the prevention of the arms race in outer space, PAROS. And I'm wondering, Minister, whether you have any plan in terms of putting forward a New Zealand resolution at the United Nations to prevent an arms race in outer space, because that seems to be the crux of this matter.
So, Laurie, no plans at present, but it's an area that I've flagged to officials that I'm interested in us exploring this issue of how we might be able to contribute to international moves to regulate space. So we're at the beginning of that process, and I don't want to jump straight to the idea of a resolution at the UN, but it's clearly, it's an issue of this time.
And there has been, I think, as you'll know, Laurie, some positive progress in recent times, as opposed to the sterile debate in the Conference on Disarmament, where, the consensus requirement meant that nothing was happening on the treaty. The UK resolution that they put forward at the General Assembly last year, I think it's hailed as kind of a useful effort to try and find a new approach between the two sides that have been so rigid on the argument. So there's some progress that I think that we can build on. Thank you for that question, Laurie. I see a question off the back. Thank you.
Oh, me? Okay, I have a question following on from Liz's one about Five Eyes. My name's Lisa, and I'm not known for being diplomatic, so I'm going to say, wouldn't it be a good idea to suggest to the US that we left Five Eyes unless they stopped increasing the nuclear weapon manufacturing and threats?
Gosh, they might say, make our day.
Just a little challenge.
Yes, thank you.
Minister, you spoke about the vessel that was sent off by the New Zealand government, and you've also spoken of the inhumanity of the nuclear weapons. Those sailors on those ships were exposed to radiation.
Because we're trying to take the feed. Would you mind using the microphone?
Okay.
Thank you.
You spoke about the ships that were sent up to protest about the French testing. Those ships were sent without adequate protection for those sailors. They have objected for years. Can you give a commitment that the New Zealand government will apologise to them for what happened to them, for the failure to address their concerns, and that the government will give a commitment to provide generous support for them, their children and their grandchildren? Thank you.
Do you mean the protest ships that fled to London?
I'm talking about the sailors who went on HMS
Pukaki and...
Canterbury
Oh, okay, right, okay.
And who were there, and if they hadn't gone, they would have been court-martialed for cowardice. So they were forced to go.
Okay. Look, I haven't been advised on that, and I haven't even considered it, so I'd be very happy to hear more about it if you want to send me some information. So, but I won't venture an opinion now without having had any advice or given it any thought.
And maybe making it clear why the Veterans Affairs pensions that they've been given, are seen as inadequate, what additional measures should be by those survivors?
Well, I made submissions to the Act on the bill last year, so I'm more than happy to bring it. I actually made submissions last year on that piece of legislation, and the provision for servicemen was actually reduced rather than increased by that statute. So really, the ministers do know about this, but they just won't give a commitment.
Okay. All right. So I haven't been engaged with the issue at all. So, but I'd be very happy to receive information from you on it. So. And what's the other?
There's another one.
Oh, Lisa. Yeah, you're right, Lisa. Don't go into diplomacy as a career change.
There's no future in it.
But I mean, it would be something that you could do.
Theoretically, yep. Lisa, I won't. It's way beyond my brief as Disarmament and Arms Control Minister to comment on Five Eyes. So I won't.
Yes, my name's Red. Hi, Minister. I just wanted to know, will there be an innovative way of disarmament, since some countries are not willing to disarm totally, like 100%? We've seen with North Korea, and other rich countries also wouldn't want. When they get rich, they want to get nuclear weapons. Would there be an innovative way of disarmament?
So explain to me a bit more about your idea. What would be the actual idea for achieving it?
Yeah, would there be an innovative way rather than just asking them to disarm totally?
Yeah.
Would there be an innovative way, a new way, rather finding like new form of disarmament or new form of technology or different ways of disarming?
Yeah, that's intriguing, and I don't know. I mean, it's all, and I think it's really actually refreshing to ask ourselves, just try to step outside the paradigm, and we have a nuclear disarmament paradigm that's sort of, 70 years old now, and to wonder actually how could it be done differently? How could we find a way to develop a compelling alternative for the nuclear weapons-free states, for them to think about security for their people and for their countries? I don't know. Maybe there is a way. Maybe technology could play a part. My kind of track is that I'm on the arguably a very conventional 20th century mode, which is about political campaigning and achieving policy change at the governmental level, negotiating multilateral agreements. This highly incremental kind of progress. But I'm very open to the fact that there might be different ways of doing it.
So the Minister's inviting an email from you, I guess.
Talk to my people. That's me, basically.
Yes, please, at the back first.
Kia ora. My name's Lauren Watson. I'm a law and health science student at this university. I've taken the wonderful esteemed course of Trust Dunworth. I am particularly interested in biological weapons and was hoping you could maybe comment on the efficacy of World Health Organization investigations into biological weapons breaches, considering how we've seen the World Health Organization investigations go on over the past year and kind of the roadblocks that we've seen in those investigations.
I'd love to be able to comment on that, if I knew anything about it, but I don't, so I'd have to. Yeah, it's beyond. It's not something that I've looked at or been advised on. So sorry. Okay.
Thank you. My name is Algus Mack. I'm the Honorary Consul for Lithuania. I just want to thank everybody who has so far enabled this treaty for weapons. Thank you very much. But I do pose a question. Will you expand that treaty to cover unsafe nuclear installations in the future? As everybody knows, Europe was within a hair whisker of destruction through the Chernobyl incident. And I'd just like to point out that the Soviets at this stage are building an unsafe nuclear installation 40 kilometres from our border. The cooling water will flow through our capital. Sorry, it's 40 kilometres from our capital. The IAG, the International Nuclear Association, has deemed it an unsafe construction. And it was commissioned, I believe, in the first week of December, or stage one was, and last week there was a shutdown, an emergency shutdown. So the question is, will there be support? I mean, nuclear weapons are evil, but also unsafe nuclear installations are equally as destructive. Thank you.
That's a hair-raising bit of information that you've shared with us, and I can understand why people in Lithuania would be very concerned. But I would say, though, that I would be very reluctant to advocate for a nuclear disarmament treaty like this to have its scope broadened. I think that we have to, issues of environmental catastrophe and contamination, we do, they don't necessarily respect national borders, and we do need to use international law. We do need to use multilateral institutions to find solutions on those matters. But I would, just as we're trying to breathe life back into nuclear disarmament and getting rid of nuclear weapons, I'd be very, very reluctant to broaden the scope any more than it is now. That would be my feeling.
Thank you very much, Minister. I think we're going to call an end now
Sure.
because you have to get across town.
I do.
Can I take this opportunity to thank you very much for coming today, for making an official celebration of the entry into force of our treaty, and for answering questions. Thanks again to our Auckland organisers, and I know you're going to have the final word before we wish you all a very happy evening to continue your celebrations of the entry into force of the TPNW.
Very good. Thank you.